Dr. Michael Platt, thank you for doing this. Really excited.
Me too. Thanks for having me on, Ben.
During my prep, it was nice to go through your work because it feels like you're making concrete quite a squishy subject when it comes to social connection.
Yes.
I'm sure you.
Well, I hope that's true. I mean, I thought you were going to say making concrete a squishy subject, meaning the squishy being the brain, but which is quite squishy, but that is where all of our social connections come from. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really fun and fascinating time to be in social neuroscience, to be doing social neuroscience, because I think the last 25 years, what we as a field have worked on is really trying to make that squishy, much more concrete and rigorous. And honestly, it's the trickiest, most complicated kind of thing you could study. So that's been a long road to get here.
Well, I mean, I think you're doing a wonderful job. I think giving people, sadly, I think, and I bucket myself in this bracket, that I think people know the value of social connection, but then when they read a paper from an authority figure in a journal like Nature, it's hard to ignore, and you have to take that kind of thing seriously. I'd love to start off just sort of zooming out before we dive into some of your work, which is wonderful to read, is how are our brains wired for social connection?
Yeah, this is a great point. I mean, it's a real discovery made by the collaborative efforts of many people over the last 20 years or so. But essentially, each and every one of us has within our brains something we call a social brain network, and it's a set of brain areas that are wired together and that that is specialized and for navigating our moment-to-moment interactions with other people, and it also manages our long-term relationships with those people as well. It sort of basically begins at the back of the brain, where the pixelated view of the world that comes in through our senses, such as through our eyes, reassembled into images, and then this social brain network starts to say, hey, there's a person there, right? And that person is familiar or unfamiliar, or they're old or young. So certain characteristics about them begin to be processed, and then that information flows forward from kind of back to front, if you will, in the social brain network. And more sophisticated computations are performed. And essentially there's two main pathways, one that's lower in the social brain network you can think of as being more emotional. So its job is to figure out what somebody might be feeling based on facial expressions, tone of voice, how big their pupils are, things like that. And that information flows into the front of the brain and hits a couple of key spots which is where empathy lives. And so we know that the more activity you have in those quote unquote brain empathy areas predicts how likely you'll be to help somebody. So that's the emotional pathway. Then there's one that's higher up in the brain, it's a little more cognitive, and its job is to figure out what somebody's mental state is. So what are they paying attention to? What do they think is important? What are their goals, desires? And even things like, are they trustworthy if you've interacted with them in the past? Or are they more likely to be a cheater? Are they a cooperator? And then those two streams, emotional and cognitive, come together and they hit this spot right at the intersection of my fingers, which is where utility lives. The economic concept of utility has a real physical embodiment in the brain. And those utility signals basically govern what we do next. Do we approach that person? Do we run away? Do we help them? Do we hinder them? Do we negotiate fairly? Do we cheat? Do we cooperate? And that's the social brain network.
Love that. How did you come to piece all this together?
Well, like I said, it's a collaborative effort across lots and lots and lots of labs. And I think that one of the important things in terms of understanding this network and the key components was, first of all, the emergence of non-invasive technologies for basically scanning the human brain while people are engaged in tasks like looking at people or thinking about people or choosing whether to give somebody money, things like that, which would kind of help to highlight what some of the key structures are. And then in animal studies, we can go a bit deeper and go closer to the sites of activity and basically try to understand how the individual neurons, or actually more likely many hundreds of thousands of neurons in each of these little spots in the brain, encode information such as what does somebody look like, or what's their emotional state, or do I have a memory of them from the past? What's my prediction about what they're going to do next? So this is like the effort of many, 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 many people. And, it's really, at this moment, it's incredibly gratifying that our knowledge is so deep, because we now know that, people who have more friends, this social brain network is bigger. So it's actually physically larger. The connections between the neurons are thicker and more numerous, which means that it's better able to do its job. You can put more information in there. You can use it better. And we know this is deeply baked in, this relationship between the health and vitality of our social brain network, and how many relationships we can navigate, because we see it in monkeys too. So, when we discovered this in our own studies of monkeys living on an island off the coast of Puerto Rico, the more friends a monkey has, the bigger their social brain network. It was pretty remarkable.
So how do those monkey studies, how do they translate to human behavior?
Well, I think they translate nearly perfectly. I mean, that's one reason why, half of my life I study monkeys, half of my life I study humans, and we compare directly in terms of behavior, in terms of genetics, in terms of brain structure and brain function, in terms of physiological responses, in terms of what they look at, their attention. And we look at them doing similar things. So we have them playing the same games in the lab, like we have monkeys and humans playing soccer against each other, which is pretty fun. You can't tell the difference if I don't tell you who's playing and you're just looking at the behavior, you can't tell the difference. They're kind of equally sophisticated, but that's sort of like the ways in which we begin to tease apart how all this works. And then, because this is our argument, and this is our argument from evolutionary biology, because the biology basically looks the same, the behavior looks pretty much fundamentally the same, or very similar, seems to rise in similar patterns over development, like from birth to childhood. It's probably the same thing.
I love this show on Netflix. The name escapes me, but it's about different groups of chimps. And watching it, it's like holding a mirror up to humans. And I feel like I went in looking for knowledge about chimps, and I came out with loads of research about humans, which was super interesting. I'd love to shift gears to sort of oxytocin and vasopressin, because I think these things get thrown around a lot. But how do they relate to human connection and how humans actually bond together?
Right. So oxytocin and vasopressin are a couple of peptide hormones that are made in our brains. And they can, in a small number of neurons in the deep part of the brain, and then they're released kind of widely into the brain, and they also have important roles in our peripheral physiology. So, and oxytocin and vasopressin are ancient; they're probably 500 million years old. So they've been around since vertebrates have been around, animals and skeletons. And oxytocin is probably the best known. People talk about it as the love hormone. Its kind of primary job in humans and other mammals, so animals that have fur and produce milk for their offspring, but it has a role in childbirth, and it has a role in bonding between moms and babies. So it's released when a mom breastfeeds her child. It's released, and that seems to be important for kind of upregulating attention, so that the mom and the baby look at each other deeply, and they start to form this emotional bond. Oxytocin in humans and other primates has been conscripted to play a broader role in social connection. And so, for example, when you can get oxytocin into the brain by snorting it up your nose, and it gets taken up by nerves that are in your sinuses and transported into the brain. Actually, our lab was the first to demonstrate that in monkeys. So when you do that, this increases attention to others. It improves your ability to read emotional cues. It generally tends to make individuals more cooperative. It increases synchronization of behavior, which is involved in kind of liking and cooperation and a number of other trust and things like that. So it seems to have a really broad impact, mostly pro-social. And there's been a lot of debate, over the last decade or so about whether it's purely pro-social or it just turns up all social processes, like if you're in a competitive context to make you more competitive. And there are some studies that in humans that have suggested that, yeah, it makes you, bond more with people who are in your group, but it makes you hate people out of your group even more.
Right.
I say the jury's still out on that. That's a bit harder to study. So vasopressin is like similar to oxytocin. It's less well studied, but it has a bigger role in males than females. Oxytocin has a bigger role in females than males. It's also involved in water regulation, but basically has the same kind of pro-social effect. So if you introduce oxytocin into the brain through inhalation, it turns up cooperation, makes monkeys, makes people more relaxed in tense social situations. So it's kind of a social lubricant, if you will.
What naturally boosts oxytocin, apart from like some sort of peptide spray into the nose? How can you actually cross that?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you can buy oxytocin or what's purported to be oxytocin nasal spray, off the internet. It's, like Liquid Trust. But let's imagine you don't want to do that and you want to get oxytocin going naturally, which you can do. There are several ways. I mean, so it appears that making good positive eye contact is one way to get oxytocin flowing. Another really powerful way to get oxytocin released is through positive social touch. So humans, monkeys, mice, basically all animals in the hairy parts of our skin, like on your forearm, have these receptors that don't do anything but tell your brain you're being touched nicely by another person. Okay, so it's like that, and it's particularly effective at the way that, like, when you're stroking a child or something to make them feel better, that goes right into the brain, hits those oxytocin producing neurons, and you get the release of oxytocin. So it's really intriguing because, first of all, I study monkeys, and monkeys spend a lot of time grooming each other and picking through their fur. They're not really cleaning each other. That's an investment in a relationship. That's how they form friendships. And so they're releasing oxytocin through that touch. Now, it's really fascinating when you look at people, because there's certain jobs that people do where there's a lot of touch involved, namely sports. So if you look at sports teams where team chemistry, being dialed into one another, being cooperative, being able to read social cues, to know, that no-look pass is coming to you on the basketball court, probably oxytocin's involved in that. And what do you see? You see a lot of high fives. You see, everybody touching each other in the huddle in positive ways. And so I think that's pretty interesting circumstantial evidence that that's probably involved in good team chemistry. And there were a couple of studies in the NBA. This was like, I don't remember, 5 or 10 years ago, showing that those teams that had the most high fives and the most touching actually they performed best. And sometimes there was like, they had statisticians on teams who were counting up, how often they'd high five and whatnot. So the touch is really important. It's been argued that we're living through an epidemic of lost touch, that this is built into us for a reason by evolution, and it's a shared heritage and important for bonding. But for a lot of really important reasons, right, we're all pretty wary of touch. We're wary of touch in the workplace or in school, et cetera, and for good reason. On the other hand, this may be putting us in a position where we are lacking some of those inputs that would normally be helping to, serve as the glue for society. So I don't know what the answer is there.
Neither do I, if out of interest. Yeah. If you're expecting one, I mean, just to quash all expectation there. The interesting thing, when you're talking about that, my head goes to the modern world. And firstly, eye contact. Like if I'm looking at the camera now, that means, I guess, from your point of view, it looks like I'm looking at
Oh
you.
yeah, you're looking right at me.
I'm looking right at you, right? But actually, your picture's here. And I'm aware that on your camera, it doesn't look like I'm looking directly at you. And so obviously, if we're doing this in person, I like to think, we'd have more eye contact, things like this, and maybe we could synchronize a bit better or whatever it is. But most of human dialogue now is going on Zoom and things like this, and it's much more normal in our life, which I don't know if is good or bad. And then the touch element. So how does technology play a role in actually hindering these evolutionary processes we need to connect?
Yeah, well, I think I mean these are astute observations. You can't make eye contact online given the current technology. I always teach people, yes, you have to look up at that little green light, on your monitor, and then your partner feels bathed in your gaze, but it feels horribly awkward to me. I want to see what's going on with you.
Yeah.
This is how our brains have evolved and developed, for life in the real world. People in full three-dimensional technicolor, right? And that's not what we get online. And so we think that is a major cause of one of the most common experiences we've had, especially during since the pandemic. Zoom fatigue, Teams fatigue, whatever. Your brain just has to work a lot harder to figure out what's going on with the other person because the information is degraded, right? It's less clear, it's slowed down, it's smaller, you can't make eye contact, I can't see what's going on. If you had glasses on, forget it. I wouldn't know if your eyes were open or closed. And so we think that's a source of Zoom fatigue. I don't think there's really a good way around it until we invent the real holodeck from Star Trek: The Next Generation, where we have full immersive virtual reality that it's indistinguishable from reality. So what are you going to do? Well, I think the thing you can do is take breaks, and we showed that taking breaks gives your brain a reset, and when you come back after that break, your brain is more engaged, more motivated, ready for deeper thought and deeper connection. If you don't take a break, then it's basically kind of useless and out the door. So we can take breaks, but before you jump in, I do want to say that I mean that's sort of a very I don't know, functional way in which this has impacted our lives. But there's I think a deeper one, that gets at I think the mental health issues that are affecting so many people, especially young people these days, which when technology gets between us and other people, as it has increasingly over the past few decades, and especially in the last few years, it means that we're not having those real, meaningful, natural social interactions, and that's unhealthy because our brains are designed to rely on those real interactions to thrive and to be healthy and to be happy.
We had a man called Dr. Tommy Wood on yesterday, and we're talking about Alzheimer's and dementia, and how if you don't have enough cognitive load, essentially that stimulus to keeping your brain active and buoyant, essentially, will start to decline. And then put through the lens of socializing, I'm sure this is great, but it's not the same stimulus or demand as if we were doing this in person. And what scares me is of someone like Facebook switching their whole strategy to metaverse and trying to push people away from innate human connections. And actually, I don't know, but that doesn't sound like it would do any wonders for the problems we face with Alzheimer's and dementia, and warding off those kind of diseases.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with you. In terms of the healthiest things you can do for your brain in terms of extending your health span, which is the length of time over which you're cognitively and emotionally functional. The first is physical exercise. So physical exercise is vital to our body, the health of our bodies, but it's vital to the health of our brains. It increases vascularization of the brain, but it also reduces inflammation, which is the thing that kills our brains. That's what leads our brains to deteriorate. So physical exercise. And also physical exercise keeps us, mentally sane as well. But social exercise, which a lot of people don't realize. I mean, it's not just that it's important for us to feel kind of happy and engaged and have a sense of purpose and meaning. But if you look at, and this is from recent studies looking at the impact of various factors on kind of time to dementia or Alzheimer's, if you will. And, we all had already been, I think, well appreciated the impact of physical exercise. That's the number one way kind of to stave off cognitive decline. But it turns out that social interaction is even more effective. It had like twice the impact. So, what that says to me is like, wow, what you need to do is go out and find a running group or go find a bunch of folks to go play football with, or play basketball with, because then you're getting exercise and you're getting social stimulation at the same time.
It's such a positive message. It's so uplifting. I love it. It's I think it gives a lot of people who would sort of push that aside and, I don't know, be more pursuit orientated with solo pursuits of health to actually make it, the collaborative, more fun, just it's fun for the sake of doing it, is actually the healthiest way as well, which I think is a beautiful message. One thing I really enjoyed in my prep for this episode was your paper in Nature and around reciprocity. I mean, I read a book called Influence by Robert Cialdini, which I'm sure you've heard of, and he's got this wonderful chapter on reciprocity. And then there's some other books which link it to our sort of evolutionary past, but yet nothing concrete until this paper. And it was amazing to come across it. Can you tell us how the brain registers reciprocity, and maybe just what the sort of reciprocity principle would be?
Sure. So this was also one of my favorite results, and that paper was my dream study for the last 25 years. So where we basically recorded brain activity in monkeys who were doing monkey things. So we just left them alone, with their friends, and just let them behave. And then we changed the context of kind of who was around and watching them, and could introduce like threatening stimuli just to see how they would respond. But what was so exciting to us was to, first of all, observe behavioral reciprocity or equity. So we always knew that monkeys like people behave as if they have sort of an internal mental account of investments and withdrawals in a social relationship. So for monkeys, that's grooming, which we already talked a little bit about. So it's like if I scratch your back for 10 minutes, then I'm expect you'll scratch my back for 10 minutes later. And, monkeys seem to behave as if they obey that principle. And that's a foundation, the bedrock of their society. For us, it's kind of like, calling each other up to go get coffee or go get a beer. Maybe these days it's like texting, so this sense of like, you know how you have that feeling when like you started to text somebody and they're not responding and you're like, are they ghosting me? It's like, I've texted you 10 times and I haven't heard back. You start to get feeling very anxious. I think that's what we've uncovered. So in our study, we looked at grooming by pairs of monkeys over the course of a month. And we could measure every single interaction that they engaged in. And they were highly equitable, highly reciprocal in their behavior. But sometimes it took a long time. Sometimes they would be like, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, back and forth over the course of minutes. Sometimes it took weeks to get balanced. So one monkey would have been given all the grooming, like a whole week, and he didn't get anything back, and then it would come back and he could bask in, getting all this nice love and attention. And, but they reached perfect reciprocity over the course of the study. And what we found is that, the brain tracked that perfectly. So there's a signal in the brain that is the physical ledger of these investments and withdrawals in the social relationship, right? And so I think that is really profound, because if monkeys have it, we've got it. It's definitely in our heads. I think that's why we feel that sense of anxiety and urgency when somebody's not responding to us, right? You're like, hey, I'm putting in all the effort here. Where's when am I going to get something back? And I think that's something we need to that we can focus on and try to leverage, right? So everybody's looking for equity. Everybody's looking for some degree of evenness and fairness, right, in all of our interactions. And maybe it's just this case that like it's hard to track so many because honestly, we are engaging in with far greater numbers of people than the brains of our ancestors ever had to do. I mean, for our ancestors, let's say 10,000 years ago, we're living in groups of 20, 40, 60 people who had face-to-face contact every day. And now, how many people do you casually interact with or communicate with on any given day? It could be hundreds, right? So it might be that our brains are challenged in a unique new way, or that or that since so much of it is happening in via technology and in a virtual way, that there's something about the lack of energetic investment of time and energy in that. It's like if I can just squeeze out a few emojis to somebody, it's like our brains are kind of attending to that and feeling something about it, but it's not the same thing as like actually going to help somebody move or to paint their apartment, which is a much bigger deal.
Yeah, for sure. I think it as you said, the word was profound. I think it is profound. I think if you can give, positive experiences and, you show interest and you show eye contact and you're actually genuinely showing up, you'll get that back in spades. My favorite example of this is the elevator one you should probably have heard of, where you go into an elevator, you say good morning, people say good morning. You go into an elevator, you say, you start cursing them and wishing them the worst day ever, as if, who would do that, right? I'm sure you'll get it back. And you go into a lift and do nothing, no one says anything. And it's just
nothing.
Perfect example of this in practice. And I think that principle alone can do a lot for solving this loneliness epidemic. If people had the courage to go first a bit.
I totally agree with you. And like I'm a guy who, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I was super shy and I never talked to anybody. And my parents would force me to like call the pizza delivery, place to order pizza. And it was really, I would sweat and I was very anxious. It was very hard for me to talk to people. But the more I've worked in this area, the more I try to put into practice what I'm learning, because it's like, wow, this is really important. And the more you exercise, the better you get at it. And that elevator story is really interesting because I had this experience, that was last year, I think, and I was getting in the elevator at a hospital, and there was a man in the elevator who was older. He seemed downtrodden and kind of unhappy. And I said, hi, how are you doing? And he said, wow, much better now. Thanks for seeing me. I mean, it was like, he says, it was nice to be seen. It's nice to be seen. So I think we forget, right? What a core part of our own well-being that is.
For sure. And I mean, that's such a lovely human example as well. I think what, imagine your field of sort of neuroscience with, what was the word? Neuroeconomics. Does that touch into behavioral economics at all? And if so, I guess loss aversion would be an interesting topic around this, right? Of what would stop people actually risking that move to reach out in a social way first.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So neuroeconomics, I've kind of been around in that field since the beginning, which was in the late 1990s. And it's this merger of the mathematical formalisms of economics and the experimental approaches from psychology and neuroscience. And it's all been aimed at trying to figure out how we make decisions, but also how to account for some of these so-called irrationalities of decision making, like loss aversion or sort of tyranny of choice, things that economists can't explain, right, through anything other than appeals to psychology. Actually, it turns out that what's going on is these are kind of bugs, if you will, in the system, a system that evolved to be an efficient decision maker in settings that are not the settings that we find ourselves in now. And so, our brains are designed to be efficient and to take shortcuts and to throw out lots of information. And that's why we make some of these foibles like loss aversion. We've done a number of studies on the neurobiology of loss aversion. And as it turns out, basically there are two kinds of loss averse decision makers that look the same on the outside. One type is just like anything where if it's a gamble or anything, I just don't want anything to do with it. And the other is one that feels the pain of losses more than the pain of gains, as Danny Kahneman initially kind of hypothesized. And what's happening is their brains are paying more attention to the things you could lose than the things you can win. Okay. And that starts with just what you attend to and what you look at. And so we demonstrate that. And one thing that's really amazing is that's not necessarily built in as a preference. So what we're, where we look in the world is a function of what we're looking for. Okay. If I'm looking for threats, I look at possible threats, but also what the world looks like. So one of the things that we did was to just make the possible gains, financial gains in a gamble, bigger or brighter, which attracts attention. And people would look at the bigger or brighter things. Whatever you look at gets turned up in your brain. We could erase loss aversion by sort of making the glass half full much more obvious than the glass half empty. And I think that's a really interesting thing too, because, one of the only things that we have some control over in terms of our moment to moment interactions with the world is what we pay attention to. What we pay attention to gets turned up. If I pay attention to you, you get turned up in my brain at the expense of all the other distractions that are out there. If you pay attention to the good things that are possible, right, or that are happening, and this is a long tradition of thinking, like thousands of years old, when you pay attention to those possible good things or the good experiences you're having, they get amplified in your brain and they get expensive the negative stuff. And that's, I think, a key to well-being. That's a key to drive and happiness. I mean, we actually know it now. I mean, that is like, as you attend to things that are surprisingly better than you thought they would be, you're happier.
I've long had a theory that your perception is your reality, and you can make a heaven of a hell or a hell of a heaven, right? And I like it when someone clearly smarter than me says something like that, and I feel vindicated with my theory. I've never quite had the bottle to talk about it live on air, which is good. We like that. You're at a pretty unique lens of to understand people and to know what humans are all about, right? I mean, I think this is one thing you can talk about, but it seems like there's lots of things you can talk about as well, which was sort of quite part of the problem with this prep as well. When it comes to humans, what surprised you the most through your research?
Wow, that's a big question. The thing that, I always had this sense that we were very, at heart, at brain, not so different from our primate cousins. And the more, the more we look at it, the more that seems to be true. There is one big difference, which is language. And there's no other animal that we're aware of that has true language, which is a combination of syntax and semantics, so meaning and order that you can generate new meanings. That's never been observed. So that, I think, is, on the one hand, that's kind of what I wanted it to be for some reason, but it turns out to be truer than I ever thought. And wherever we look, we see more of that, of your inner monkey there. And, we see it, we see it in, marketing and advertising. We published on that. Our not just fascination, but intense drive to attend to, people who are powerful, people who are attractive and sexy. Those priorities are deeply baked into our brains and are massively exploited in marketing to good effect. So sex and celebrity sell. And we have a new paper that's in the works, which I'm trying to get out before the election, in the U.S. election this fall, because it's something that I intuited. I tried to run this study, and we finally ran it. And what we've shown is that basically monkeys can predict the outcomes of U.S. elections, any elections anywhere, honestly. So, and they don't need to hear their policies or their platforms. You just have them look at the candidate photos, and they preferentially view, one of the photos over the other, and you can train a decoder on that, and we can predict election outcomes. better than chance. It's not like 100%, but still really darn good within the margin of difference between, in the US, the two parties. So if we ignore this, we do so at our peril. It's just like people show up at the, at the polling place and they look at the pictures of the two candidates. They're like, oh, well, I'm going to vote for as it turns out, one who looks more dominant. And in fact, we can predict vote share across Senate, Congress, governor's races, you name it, really accurately based on that, which is
That's amazing.
Pretty profound.
That is. So if we were to double click on which photo would win, right? What would the traits be? What would they be? I mean, would it be? I'm trying to guess.
Nobody's going to want to hear this because it's too demoralizing. But it's the width of the jaw relative to the width of the eyes, and no matter whether we're looking at male versus female, female, and the width of the jaw is a secondary sexual characteristic that's correlated with testosterone levels during development and older adulthood. So I'm not saying that it makes anybody more competent. It certainly does not, or trustworthy or anything like that. Those have been some of the arguments in the past. But what you have to understand is, since monkeys are cluing in on this, and monkeys know nothing about elections, nothing about candidates, but they have a built-in attentional focus toward individuals who have those qualities, which in a sort of dog eat dog or monkey world are going to be predictive of fighting prowess, of dominance, of power. And it's not the only factor, but it's a good heuristic, a good cue. And it turns out humans are paying attention to that too. It's been known for, there was a study that was done in the 1990s, I think, that showed that people could predict like how high in the military a West Point cadet would rise based on their freshman year photo. Okay. Wow. And it was based on similar characteristics. It's not to say that's fair or anything like that, but I think that, again, you can't ignore it, right? And do what you can to try to kind of suppress that out of your head. But it's like when you're just navigating the world and operating on more or less, unconscious autopilot, which is what we do most of the time. Those are the things that are going to capture your attention. What you attend to gets turned up in your brain, and one thing leads to another, and it's affecting the choices that you make.
One of my favorite pieces of writing is Charlie Munger's Psychology of Human Misjudgment, which basically says that here are all the ways humans get tripped up, and here are default unconscious biases, and if you're aware of them, you can mitigate them. But then paired with that, with Danny Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, was asked, after all these years of studying human biases, how can you overcome them? And, what's your strategy? He's like, the one thing I've learned is I can't. So it's just like, oh no, all this wasted time. But it's a really interesting.
Well, I think that, I lean more toward Danny Kahneman because I think, another area where we see biases in particular is unconscious or implicit ethnic or race-based biases, which continue to persist, right? And continue to gum up the works in terms of advancement of minoritized groups in business and other organizations, despite decades of bias awareness training that is mandatory in most institutions. So you have to ask yourself, why? Why hasn't this gone away? Right? And it hasn't gone away because it is unconscious, it's implicit, and it's a function of the way our brains learn about who we are and the tribe to which we belong, which is through our patterns of interactions when we're younger. So if you're encountering people who look like you almost exclusively, that's what your brain says you are, and who's included, and who you attend to and is in your social brain network. People who are look different, right? Then if you're only encountering them later in life, they're just not going to be admitted into that kind of tribe of humanity. And so your brain processes information about them a little bit differently. And it's not uniquely human. This again, this is the way all brains work. And so you see the same kind of implicit bias in rats, for example. So rats show empathy. Rat will help a rat who's trapped in a tube. It depends on the same part of the brain as it does in people, this sort of brain empathy area, because if you turn it off in a rat, which you can do temporarily, then they won't help the trapped rat. But who that rat helps depends on who they grew up with. So a white rat who's raised with white rats will help a white rat, but not a black rat. Let that sink in. A white rat who's raised with black rats will help a black rat, but not a white rat. But a rat who's raised with a mixed group of black and white rats will help all rats. And so it's like, this is powerful stuff, right? I think that finding is important for a whole variety of reasons, right? It tells us that it's not just that people are evil or whatnot. There are evil people, but that's not the root cause of this. But it has to do with how our brains make sense of the world, and then suggests a potential remedy, which is not so much like bias awareness training, but rather a policy implementation, which is that diversity is the route to equity. Because if we make our schools more diverse, kids are encountering kids who look different from them, their brains are going to be more open to more kinds of people, right? Than if they're going to schools where they're seeing people who only look like them. And same even as we get older, because our brains are still plastic. So we can continue to evolve, if you will.
I think that's a really, really powerful finding, and I think more diversity in our social lives and actually consciously trying to foster that in, I think is only for the good. And again, I'm so pleased when people say the brain is still plastic as well, because I think there's this underlying hangover from you get to 25 and your brain's fixed and you can't do anything, and I think that in turn will shape your perception of what is and isn't malleable, which I think is important. I'd love to, when it comes to social connection, I'd love to explore how hormones play a part and how sort of endocrinology. I mean, we spoke about the monkeys who could predict the potential winners by seemingly jaw size and sort of prenatal endocrine exposure or whatever it would be. How do hormones from a male side and a female side play a part in social bonding, if at all? I don't know, to be honest.
Well, I mean, I think it's less well studied, certainly less well studied in humans, and more studied in rodents, who are not so like humans, for a variety of reasons. So it makes it a little bit tricky to really figure out. And obviously, there's a lot of debate and controversy, around the whole issue of endocrines and sex hormones. But what we have seen, well, this is pretty, I think, common in many mammals, is that more testosterone tends to increase aggressive behavior. It can increase posturing behavior. My colleague Gideon Nave in the marketing department here at Wharton has done some really interesting studies that are really, I think they're important because they're done at the highest standards in terms of large sample size, randomized controlled trials. So you don't know if you're getting testosterone or placebo. These are androgen gels, which are used by people to increase muscle, to build muscle. And it turns out that those increase, it's really interesting, but increases risk taking, perhaps not surprising, financial risk taking, increases preferences for status goods, like to show off, to get bling. So more testosterone, more bling seeking, if you will. And also this, and I'm sure this will resonate with a lot of people, it also reduces cognitive reflection. So it essentially makes you dumber. And so these, there are tests that kind of have a default quick answer that's the wrong answer, right? Or if you stop and think for a few minutes, then you actually get the right answer. And I mean, so boy, doesn't that sound familiar? And so let's set aside intrinsic variation in these hormones, but think about the millions of people who are, say, applying androgen gels to work out and to build muscle tone, that could be changing their behavior, could be changing their preferences. A lot there. I don't know how prevalent this is now, but there was a time not so long ago, in the last decade or so, when older men who were traders, and they're kind of felt like they were losing their edge, so they're in their 40s or whatever, and that's kind of when testosterone begins to decline. We're using these brush on, androgel or whatever, and because they thought it would give them an edge in competitiveness. Wow, think about what might happen in terms of, like, if you had how many people would it take to shape markets if they are becoming more risk-seeking, kind of more display-oriented, less reflective in terms of their thinking? It could have widespread economic consequences.
Not good. Something really bizarre in America that, as Brits, we look over it and look, some marketing genius, and I don't think for good, basically rebranded steroids as TRT, and then it's just like all good. Everyone's on TRT into your middle age, and the therapeutic dose of topping your levels back up is one thing, but my understanding is people don't stay anywhere near the therapeutic dose and have these super physiological levels walking around at sort of ages maybe it shouldn't be that high. And yeah, the social consequences of that, if these people are in positions of power, maybe is not the best move. Takes me on to the next topic, which I thought was really interesting. Declining fertility and social connection. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about the link there?
Yes. So this is a paper we published actually just a few weeks ago in Nature Mental Health, my colleague Peter Sterling and I. And as biologists, we were deeply puzzled by the very clear trend, which has been ongoing for the last 50 years in the US, but has accelerated recently and is actually happening worldwide, which is declining fertility. And in fact, the number of live births, the number of children that any woman is having, so any couple, any woman, is well below replacement in most countries across the world. There are very clear and obvious, vivid examples such as South Korea and Italy, where you're seeing just a fundamental restructuring of society that is very topped out at the high end. People are old. We've got a massive population of older people and fewer and fewer young people. This is bizarre from a biological perspective, right? So you don't see species going into decline typically, right? So this is a really hard to explain. And people have thrown out, there are all kinds of crazy explanations out there that it's, it has to do with, well, maybe they're not all crazy, but people have zeroed in on a lot of different things. But I think that there's a couple of points to be made here. One is that, fertility is declining. It's declining worldwide, except for a few countries in Africa. This will have massive impacts on society. It's already having those impacts, namely, who's going to do all the work? Who's going to pay for the old people and take care of the older people as population structure shifts? Where are all the great ideas going to come from? Because in general, younger people are the wellspring of innovation and creativity, which then tends to fall off as people get older. And honestly, just it's also sort of a setting of lost hope. And if you've ever seen the movie Children of Men, which I think is an incredible movie, which came out around 2000, I think, it's basically a world without children. And nobody can really explain it, and it's deeply, deeply disturbing. So, from a biological perspective, how do you explain it? And what Peter and I hypothesize, it's actually this epidemic of despair. That, it's kind of a catch-all term, but it reflects the fact that the conditions that our brains and our bodies require for health and vitality and meaning are not being met, either the economic conditions or the social conditions or most likely both. So we had tied that to the epidemic of deaths of despair in the United States and other mostly Western countries in a paper we published a couple of years ago. Like why in the world was anxiety disorder. We talked about that already. Mental health disorders, alcohol, death by alcohol, death by drug overdose, suicide, et cetera, just skyrocketing. And we linked it to this sort of prevalence of despair. And we think that that's probably driving the decline in fertility too. And the reason is that it's helpful to understand how our brains invigorate reward-seeking behavior. And we talked about this a little bit before, which is basically when things are slightly better, turn out to be slightly better than you thought they were going to be, you get a little pulse of dopamine because it's saying, whatever that was, the world's getting better, do that again, move forward. And on the other hand, if it's a little worse than you thought, then you don't get that actually. And that diminishes reward-seeking behavior. And so you kind of need positive momentum to do big things in life, like commit to, having a child and actually raising it. And it's beyond 18 years. It's more like a lifelong project, right? So that's sort of the underlying motivation. And you might say, well, what's the evidence that despair is at the heart of this? Well, now for the first time in history, despair is peaking at age 18 and then kind of staying flat and then declining very slowly in middle and late age. The peak in despair was always in middle age for as long as it's been measured. So the youngest people in society, who are the ones who would be, they would have the highest fertility, are not motivated to do so.
That is it's such an interesting hypothesis, and I think that holds a lot of merit. Not that I know anything, but it sounds really interesting. A book I like on this subject is called Countdown, which talks about some of the other sort of theories of plastics and various things in our environment which could be sort of adding to the problem. Perhaps, maybe not. I don't necessarily think it's the main cause. There's so many other questions, and I know we're coming up for time. I'd love to ask. Just quickly, I know how humans synchronize, and especially in groups, and how that affects decision making. Could you tell us about that? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so it turns out that this idea of synchrony, like when you have a great relationship with somebody and you just like finish each other's sentences, maybe you show up wearing the same color every day, like my coworker Zab and I do, and we've worked together for decades. When you think you're like in sync with somebody, you literally are in sync. So as it turns out that when we have that connection, that chemistry actually reflects the fact that our brains are operating on the same wavelength. So the patterns of activity in my brain would be more similar to the patterns of activity in your brain in space and time. What that means is that we're kind of seeing the world the same way. We're perceiving it the same way. We're attending to similar things. We're feeling similar things and thinking similar things. So it's a shared mindset. And that shared mindset actually percolates down to our bodies too. So when we have chemistry with somebody, our hearts begin to beat together in time. And we breathe together and we move together. And as it turns out, you can kind of run the whole thing in reverse by moving together, breathing together can get you in sync. So there are a few things to know about synchrony. So first of all, it's not uniquely human. So we see it in other animals that are highly social. So they synchronize with each other, and that predicts their relationships. Synchrony in humans, even if you haven't met the person, if your brains process the world similarly, like watching a movie, you're more likely to become friends. So it's predictive of friendship, predictive of, we've shown, work relationships. When you increase synchrony between people, this boosts trust, communication, psychological closeness, cooperation. And we showed recently in a paper that we could measure synchrony using heart rate monitors, simple heart rate monitors, across groups of people who were tasked with being a hiring committee at a company, and those hiring committees that were in sync with each other physiologically could reach consensus on this really hard problem and make the right decision. And those committees that were not in sync either never reached consensus because they were always arguing, or they made a bad decision. And so that synchrony we find is what we think it is, it's sort of a biomarker of psychological safety. So we have the conditions met that we feel comfortable and secure to have a robust conversation and use all the information that's available. Now, I know we're butting up against time, but I want to just sneak one thing in here, which is like, okay, synchrony is awesome. It's the secret sauce of team chemistry. So how can we turn it up, right? And it turns out that there are all these things that every society on the planet engages in, has developed, that seem to be designed to increase synchrony between people so that they cooperate. And those are rhythmic activities. So singing together, chanting together, dancing together, drumming together, marching together, as in militaries, right? Performing a haka dance together in terms of, the New Zealand All Blacks, rugby. All those things synchronize our physiology, and seem to be designed, purposefully, to allow us to cooperate and work together.
All of these are such a nod to the core sort of truth. We're social beings, which I think people forget,
Absolutely,
especially in the Western world. I think a nod towards that evolutionary past, I think, only favors your own psychology in a nice, positive way. Michael, I could talk to you all day. This is so fun. My last question before I leave you is just around books and books that sort of shape your worldview. I think you've got a really interesting worldview, and you can sort of fleet over loads of different subjects effortlessly. Have you got any book recommendations for us and our audience?
Wow, I haven't thought about that in a while. I have to say that I've violated one of my maxims my entire life, is I'm always reading 3 or 4 books at a time, and I don't know, somehow I've been so busy lately that I haven't been. But I think the most important thing, first of all, is to read and read widely. But I prefer to read fiction over nonfiction, honestly. So I feel like fiction gives me deeper, like writers have honestly plumbed the depths of human nature and human psychiatry, really good writers, psychology, in a way that science is only just beginning to catch up. And so the book that I just finished was Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, which is sort of a great neuro-lit book because it's about kind of a not distant future where artificial friends are created to help children, especially children who have suffered physically because they have all been genetically engineered to be smarter, but it doesn't work for every kid. And so then they have various kinds of health problems. And so they have these artificial friends. And it's a really fascinating meditation on what it means to be human, and whether created beings could be human as well.
Wonderful. I'm really pleased to ask. Dr. Michael Platt, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you too. This has been fantastic, Ben.